There we go. Great. Well, welcome everyone to our session on the neuroscience of play. My name is Eva de Gosztonyi. I'm the coordinator of the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management and also a psychologist and a person who just loves learning about the brain. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that I have found about the neuroscience of play. And I have with me my colleague and friend, Patty Saba. She is from English Montreal School Board. Patty is a behavior specialist, and she and I have worked together for many years. And especially it's interesting because, you think, oh, behavior, what do behavior and play have to do with each other? But as you'll see today, behavior and play do have a lot to do with each other. And some of our most challenging students really need a lot of playtime. And Patty has, we've worked together on setting up making sure some classrooms of very young children, even the ones with behavior problems, have lots of playtime in them. So she will be here, my technical support today, and monitoring the chat and so on. So without further ado, let me get started here and just walk you through the neuroscience of play. So yes, well, I always figure if I understand what's going on inside of the brain, it's easier for me to convince myself to trust kind of other things that are happening and other things that we need to do. As many of you know, my mentor is Dr. Gordon Neufeld, and in the last probably about 8 or 9 years, but maybe even longer than that, he has continually brought up play as a very important part of human development, but especially the development of young children. And again, it made a lot of sense. He has a number of different courses on play, some quite long ones. But again, for me, if I can understand the neuroscience behind it, it helps me to ground me in accepting something that it's not so obvious what's actually going on. The developmental approach requires us to have faith in the developmental process. So development is not about performance. It's about actually the brain growing and developing in a way that allows us to take in what our society feels is important. So education is important, but the basis, of course, is where the brain, how the brain is developing. So I try to organize this in terms of concepts. And of course, one of the key ones is that the brain takes time to develop. There's so many parts of the brain, and I'll share some of them with you today, that need to create connections, to work together. They need to develop, they need to become enhanced, and so that it becomes a mechanism that all works together to take advantage of the knowledge that is needed in each person's life. So again, education is important, but we have to make sure that the brain that is coming to be educated is a brain that can actually process the information that it is being given. And so really, a lot of what we need to do, especially in the early years, but even all the way through, but particularly in the prior to the age of 6 to 7 years old, we really, as the adults, need to create the conditions for the growth of all parts of the brain. And as we all know, it takes a long time to grow a fully functioning human brain. And we know that at least 25 years, and that's if all goes well. And much longer, of course, if the child or the human being has been experiencing stress and trauma. So what I'm going to present today is primarily oriented just towards the regular development of children, but always keeping in mind that if a child has lived stress and trauma in their life, they are going to need more play, not less. The irony of it is they often get less play for a whole number of reasons. Now, I call this the integrative or problem-solving brain, which really allows us to realize that there's many parts of the brain that have to integrate together, right? So first they have to develop, and then they come and they work together without getting lost in each other. And that's what we mean by integration. It's the pieces of the brain working together so that, again, information that is brought in can be used in the most effective way possible. Some parts of the brain that are working here are the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, as we know, is one of the last parts of the brain to develop. It allows us to have two thoughts, two feelings at a time. It allows us to temper ourselves. It's the part of the brain that goes on the one hand, on the other hand. understand. And of course, we all know for problem solving, you need to be able to look at many aspects at one time. The key thing here is that that prefrontal cortex doesn't actually start to engage with the other parts of the brain in a very active way until at least 5 to 7 years old. We have the corpus callosum, which is basically the bridge between the two parts of the brain, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And I'll get into more about that in a little bit later. And then we have our two hemispheres, the right and the left hemisphere. The left one, which is primarily preoccupied with facts, and the right hemisphere, which is primarily preoccupied with the whole picture. And again, we need to understand that that all these parts of the brain don't function well together until they are actually starting to develop. And we need to make sure that we don't just look at one part of the brain and be happy with that, but we really need to make sure that all of the parts of the brain are growing and developing. So I'm using, for this part of the material that I'm presenting, a book written by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, where he did a full survey of right hemisphere, left hemisphere brain functioning. And he came to some very interesting conclusions. Some of you that might have studied some of this in your psychology courses know that way back in the olden days, we used to do horrible things to people's brains. We actually used to cut the corpus callosum so that the left and right hemisphere could not communicate with each other. And boy, did we ever find out some interesting things. If you want to find out about that, go read Ian McGilchrist's book, or I also have a link that I will be providing to you a bit later, where you have an interview with him. This is what I have gleaned from the material that he pulled together. So first of all, just to understand about these divided brains. We have one hemisphere that's for narrow attention that enables, and birds and animals have this, to lock into whatever they need to get. So the seed among the pebbles. And actually, the eyes on the side of the head allow one part of the brain to focus on one thing and the other part of the brain to focus on the other thing. The other hemisphere is for what he calls vigilant attention. So you look at the world at large to make sense of it, because actually the bottom line is you want to eat the seeds, not the pebbles, but the seeds, so that you can feed yourself. But you also need to be careful while you're trying to figure out which is a seed and which is a pebble, that you're not going to be eaten by somebody else. So your brain needs these two parts, one which focuses on the specific and the other which focuses on the general. In humans, we use our left hemisphere generally, and again, I'm being very general here, but most of us are right-handed, and the right hand crosses over into the left hemisphere, and exactly that. Our hand manipulates, grasps. It's the specifics of the brain. It's the details. It's like looking for the seed amongst the pebbles. And the right hemisphere is really meant to understand the world at large, how things relate to one another, and the relationship of the brain or the body or who we are as beings to all of what is out there around us. So the raison d'être, in summary, for the left hemisphere is to narrow things down to a certainty. And I'm going to use reading as my example here. We need to recognize a letter A, and we need to decide whether or not that A is going to say A or A. Okay, so there's a specific detail that needs to be sorted out before we can actually decode that particular word. And that's what our left hemisphere does beautifully. A right hemisphere is to open up, its raison d'etre is to open us up to possibility. So when I can decode that word, what does that word mean? And in life, of course, we need both. We need precision and we need the global picture. One of the things about the right hemisphere is that it is able to appreciate, and again, they have done all sorts of scientific studies looking at how the two parts of the brain function, how the kind of in action, and they look at them through the MRIs or whatever it is, PET scans or whatever it is they do. So these are generalizations that are based in neuroscience. So the right hemisphere appreciates that all things can change and flow and are never fixed and static. The left hemisphere sees them as fixed and static. And so again, is that A A or an A sound, right? The left hemisphere would like it to decide it. Now, of course, in English, we can't decide whether it's an A or an A. If you were reading in Hungarian or if you're reading in Spanish, it would be very clear. Our left hemisphere would be very happy, but our right hemisphere has to put that letter in the context of the other letters that are there to decide which actual manifestation of the sound of letter A is going to happen. And so the right hemisphere sort of searches around until it can figure out what is supposed to happen. And that's what we mean about change and flow. And of course, they're not, and it sees things as not isolated or as atomistic, atomistic, word I haven't used often, but interconnected. Okay, so the right hemisphere connects things together and makes sense of them. What he has concluded is there's evidence that those of the highest intelligence, whatever their discipline, whether it is mathematics, whether it is physics, whether it is literature, whatever, that they rely more on the right hemisphere. And again, if you think about what researchers do, they take all the bits and pieces. Like, let's think about the researchers who were trying to create the vaccine for the coronavirus. They had to get all the bits and pieces of what made up a vaccine, but then they also had to imagine how these things interacted and what could happen. So the right hemisphere is very, very important, even in scientific research. So the right hemisphere tends to see more, is more in touch with reality. So it kind of can consider this and that and the other thing. It is actually quite sophisticated. We had a tendency to think of the right hemisphere as being artistic and emotional and all of these kind of non-tangible things. But when they really looked at a well-functioning brain, they realized that a lot of the sophistication of thought and problem solving depended on the right hemisphere. Whereas the left hemisphere, it processes things. It makes sure that we are correctly seeing what needs to be seen, but it doesn't actually pull things together from a comprehension point of view. And so it is the right hemisphere that is the basis of understanding. And this is why Dr. McGilchrist called his book The Master and His Emissary. The right hemisphere being the master hemisphere that sends the emissary, the left hemisphere, out to get information and bring it back. Without information, the right hemisphere won't be able to function in a society. It needs a left hemisphere, but to function in the society, it's not just about what you know, it's about how you understand what it is that you know. And McGilchrist's conclusion is, I believe that until very recently, there's been a blindness among neuroscientists to the contributions made by the right hemisphere. So very quickly, in terms of summary here, we have our left hemisphere that is about facts, decontextualization, focusing on rules and details, looking at the abstract and wanting an answer. And so again, if we use the idea of reading, it wants to be able to recognize the letters, decode the sounds, put the sounds together to make a word, words together to make a sentence, sentence together to make a paragraph. These are all activities that are very important. But for a child, for any of us to understand what we read, we need the right hemisphere that can put those words into context in terms of the word itself, in terms of where it is in the sentence. You know, is it the word read or the word read? Well, that's going to depend on the sentence. How do I understand what's going on in this paragraph? So the right hemisphere makes sense of these details, considers the context, and seeks the understanding. Now, what we need to know here is that the right hemisphere is in rapid development during early childhood, but it requires experiences, not information to develop. And this is one of the reasons why play is so important, especially for our young children whose right hemisphere is in development. They need to have lots and lots of experiences. Telling them things does not grow the right hemisphere. Um, Between 1 and 3, there's a huge amount of blood flow in that right hemisphere, absolutely. It does shift after 3 years, right around the time when you look at language and some of visual, spatial, and certain kinds of abilities that you need. So it starts to shift over at around 3 years of age, but it is nowhere, in full development at all. The development needs to continue. And so, yes, the right hemisphere, again, sort of ask ourselves, well, which is the most important hemisphere? Well, possibly the one that develops first. It's the one that we have to lean on. The corpus callosum, very interesting here. A huge growth spurt between ages of 3 and 6, and which results in improved coordination between the two hemispheres. And if you start thinking, if you've heard Dr. Neufeld speak or heard me speak and say, oh yes, integrative functioning, being able to say on the one hand, on the other hand, that's exactly about the communication between the hemispheres. The left hemisphere brings a detail, the right hemisphere puts it into context, goes back and gets another detail. So we need our corpus callosum for the brain to be able to do that. But it doesn't actually, it's there, but it only starts really growing between 3 and 6, and it is one of the parts of the brain that continues to significantly grow and develop well into the mid-20s. So they did something like an Etch-a-Sketch, and I don't know if you guys know it, you have to use your right hand and your left hand to make things work. Prior to the age of 6 years old, most kids just can't do it. And it's not just a question of motor problems with their hand, it's also understanding how things go together. So we have to be very patient with this development. It will come, but only in its time. Okay, second concept. Play provides the ideal conditions for brain development. So very quickly, what is play? It's characterized by a sense of freedom and a sense of engagement. In the dictionary, it's called to move or operate freely in a bounded space. And we need to remember about the bounded space, because as the adults, we keep children safe so they don't have to worry about staying alive, for example. This play allows them, it's kind of like a bubble that they can play within. And so they do need to be bounded. They need to feel safe. They need to feel that people are there. But within that space, they need to be able to choose what they do, and they will only choose to do the things that are interesting to them. So Dr. Neufeld says basically there's 3 parts to play. 1, it is not work. And again, what's the difference between work and play? Play is about the activity. The focus is the activity, not the outcome. If I'm pouring sand from one container into another container, I might or might not want to fill the container or not fill the container. It's about the act of pouring. If someone says to me, oh, now be careful, don't fill the container too full, now I could be concerned about the outcome, and now it becomes work. Similarly, the engagement is in the process, not whether or not I can fill up the container, but how the container fills itself up and all the activities around it. And the engagement or the fun is in the actual activity itself. It doesn't matter how well I do it. Oops, let me just go back here. Oh, there, sorry, I went the wrong way. All right, let's just go here. So we need to be very careful when we're working with young children, not to think that because something seems playful, seems like it could be fun, where we're trying to basically embed work into play, an outcome into play, where actually we need to make sure that when we think of playtime is about whatever the child chooses to do. So things like a craft activity, beautiful, but if it's a specific outcome, making a snowman, now it becomes work. Singing a song to learn the words versus singing the song because you want to sing it in front of the parents. Doing something where the outcome will be praised or rated. And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but we have to be so careful every time we praise children for an activity that they're doing in play, we risk turning it into work, and obviously any kind of screen time. Play is also not for real, and therefore there aren't consequences. It doesn't matter if I pour too much sand into that container, the sand is going to overflow into the sandbox, and it's not the end of the world. If I'm pretending to be mad at my play sister, there's not a consequence if it's pretend, right? It's also expressive and exploratory, and as a result, there's a lot of outflow of emotional energy and engagement. And so basically, it is this bubble, and it is within this bubble that growth happens. Now let me just show you what the neuroscience is telling us about how the growth happens. There are, and again, there are all sorts of people studying different parts of the brain. I don't know how many of them talk to each other. I don't know how many of them are putting all this information together. If I ever have time in my retirement to do more study on this, maybe I will. I have just gathered bits and pieces of research that is around, some of which Dr. Neufeld has gathered together as well and has shared with me. And so I'm just going to touch on some of these these findings that are there, but you'll start to see there's a picture that emerges. So we talked about the prefrontal cortex, basically, and it houses the executive functions. So what do we know about play? Sustained engagement in an activity demands the ability to stay selectively focused on the situation at present and to tune out distractions and hold the information in our head. So when children are playing and are engaged with something, any of you that have observed in the classrooms, you see that a child who is really engaged with, as I say, pouring sand from one container into another and watching how it pours and watching all, all the, whatever it is they're doing, it doesn't matter what they're doing. One thing that's happening there is that it's developing the capacity to focus. And again, they've looked at Montessori children. And what they found was, again, I'm not an expert in Montessori education, but there are many movements in education, and Montessori is one of them, where you don't interfere with the play activity of a child. You never make a comment on what it is that they're playing. You try not to interrupt them in their play, unless, of course, it's time for food or whatever. You let them play at the rate at which they do. And what they found was that children who had fewer interruptions during their learning activities, which is what they call them in Montessori, it is the child actually engaging in play, perform better at executive function tasks than the group that were not in a school that respected play in the same way. The prefrontal cortex as well. Jack Panksepp, who unfortunately has passed away, started in the latter years of his life as a scientific researcher to really focus on play, and he has a couple of books on it. So here are just a few quotes from him. One function of play is to take you to the edge of your emotional knowledge so that you can learn what you can and cannot do to others. Okay, so he's now talking about social play. We have some Canadian researchers called Pellis and Pellis, and you'll see some quotes from them in this slide and the next slide, where they studied rough and tumble play they were actually using rats. The irony of it is that for some reason, rats have some similar brain structures that we do as humans, and that's why they use rats. It is very hard to study the brain of children who are doing rough and tumble play, because first of all, we don't let children do rough and tumble play very much. And it's really hard to study it in as way as they can. But what they found was that rough and tumble play, which, by the way, all mammals engage in. All young mammals engage in rough and tumble play. Now, we would think that if a mammal was engaging in it, it isn't just something that's lovely that they do, which is kind of fun, but kind of by the by. There must be some reason. And they basically have found that when these animals are allowed to do rough and tumble play, they actually improve their capacity to develop social skills, the ability to get along with others. Again, I'm going to read what was said here because it's very interesting. Rough and tumble play, which can ride the edge of ambiguity. When does it turn from play into not play, into something more aggressive? It requires continual reassurances that generates the neural circuits that enable animals to accurately read ambiguous social signals, right? And it builds their social intelligence and their capacity for relationship. Now, I'm not going to get into a big talk today about whether or not we should be allowing rough and tumble play in our classrooms, but some of this kind of play fighting stuff that children do, I think, needs to be tolerated, at least a certain amount of it, because it seems to make those connections happen in that prefrontal cortex. What their conclusions are, and there's a number of different researchers, as you can see, it seems to shape the prefrontal cortex and have an impact on self-regulation and planning, which is, of course, what we want our preschool programs to do. So it seems to facilitate the maturation of the inhibitory skills, because one of the things the prefrontal cortex does as well is it brings two emotions in, one emotion which kind of counteracts or inhibits the other emotion, or a thought that can counteract an emotion. Like it's not even so much about what you do, it's about what you can stop doing. And that's a really hard thing for the brain to do. And so what they found was when rough and tumble play happened, you have to reflect, look, listen, feel. You've got this urge to do it, but you've got to modulate that urge as well. And Panksepp then says that this translates into an empathy, imagination, and creative play. Now, Stephen Porges, another very interesting person who has also a large theory called the Polyvagal Theory, is basically he looked at kind of what happens in the autonomic nervous system when this kind of play goes on. And he says that we have two states that we're in. One state is when we're worried about survival, and then there's a whole bunch of things that happen with that. But how do mammals or children know when they're actually playing and not going to be hurting each other? The question is, what keeps the play from turning violent? And Porges says that it relies on a sense of safety. And so when we're not afraid, so when our children are feeling safe, and again, remember that very often when play fighting turns to violence, one of those children is usually a child who has experienced trauma and a threat to their survival. So maybe they aren't reading these things well, but well-functioning children have this ability to downregulate these defensive reactions. He calls it the vagal brake, right? Which basically means that even though you look like you are upset with each other, you know that it is in fun. And how do you know that it's in fun? Well, it's in fun because actually there are facial cues, the play face, and we all have that. Perhaps you've seen somebody who loves playing kind of slightly roughly with children, and they'll kind of do this look, and they'll go and they'll run and they'll chase and they'll maybe tickle, or they'll sometimes throw a child up, but it's all in the face that says, I'm not going to hurt you. This is going to be fun. And that actually affects the brain. And so we become sensitive to those things. And when they've done videos of animals that have played together, they see the play face. They continually reassure each other that they are still playing. And actually, very rarely do they hurt each other. They've actually even videotaped a wolf playing with a dog. As long as the two of them kind of match their play behaviors, they were actually able to play together without hurting each other. There's actually even signals that signal the end of play. One of our problems with some of our children that get into trouble is they do not read the signals very well. So when the other child is saying, I've had enough, they keep doing it. That's when the trouble happens. It's not the actual play fighting that is the problem. So we have this smiling face, we have laughter and vocalizations that let the other one know that we are still playing. And again, for most of you that have children at home, let's use your children at home as the example. You know when the two siblings, and it's often brothers, but it could be a brother and sister, are play fighting, and all of a sudden you hear a change in vocalizations. You don't even have to look over, and all of a sudden you know there's going to be trouble. And many of you walk right over and say, okay, I think we need to do something else right now, because you've already noticed the change, and you know it could go into something else. But the bottom line is, if we never let children go to some of those places, the brain isn't going to build as effectively as it should. There's this thing called complexity science, and thank goodness, now people are starting to look at the human brain as something, not just bits and pieces of things that are happening, not just something that's going to change because a reward has been given, but really this dynamic integration that's happening there. And again, complexity science says this dynamic process of integration occurs at the edge of chaos. Well, and often, again, if you walk into a classroom and you see children playing together, there is kind of this sense of the edge of chaos. I'm not saying that it's necessarily chaos, but you can't predict what's going to happen next. There is nobody telling children what to do next. It's all about what happens, what comes into the child's mind about what to do next. But what they're recognizing now is, in order for this brain to work well together, the child can't be sitting at a desk, at a table, following rules all day. In order for that to happen, there has to be enough time in the early years. So enough chaos, but enough order to provide stability, but enough dynamism for the system to continually adapt and grow. for children to be able to play things that are difficult to, and we're not going to get into a lot of that today, but I just loved this because it made sense of kind of the organized chaos that should be what we see when we allow children to play freely. And by the way, another plug here, the more we can take our children outdoors, the less we have to worry about what they can and can't do, because the outdoors is a whole lot more forgiving. And so this integrated slate enables a system to move towards maximizing complexity, and that's about the system's optional functioning. I try to remember, oops, sorry, I'll go back here. Dan Siegel. Dan Siegel, again, another person who studied a lot about the brain. He says that optimal functioning systems are flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. And again, if you go into Dan Siegel's work, he talks about developing social skills, how children develop social skills. But it is really this kind of paradox, because we want our children to be able to manage themselves, but they can't manage themselves unless we give them a chance to figure out how to manage themselves. And we need to give it a lot of leeway. Just a couple of other little ideas that Panksepp brought up, and this is around ADHD. So he says that one of the things he looked at was psychostimulants. So Ritalin actually reduced the natural play urges of human children. But a regular diet of physical play each and every day during childhood should alleviate ADHD symptoms and diminish the number of kids on clinical track. And let me just make a little sidebar here again. We know that the children who get diagnosed with ADHD are, for the most part, the youngest, besides certain children, but there's a huge tendency of the youngest children in a classroom of being diagnosed with ADHD. Well, because if they enter kindergarten, and I have seen that at 3 years old, and if we don't have a highly play-based K4 program, those children will have missed nearly 12 months of playtime. And that is going to be part of what contributes to their ADHD. And so he basically says, play will have long-term pro-social benefits for children's brains that the psychostimulants can't do. And the other thing that he worries about is that if we just keep putting kids on drugs, they're going to actually seek out drugs when they get older. The trouble is we can't conduct genetic studies profile, activation of gene activation in human beings. We just can't do that. And so he says we would probably see that the brain that's on psychostimulants, so the ADHD child who's been given Ritalin as early as some of them as 4 years old, that their brain will look different than the child who's not on psychostimulant. But you can't give a psychostimulant to a child who doesn't warrant the prescription. So we can't just take two well-functioning children and put one on Ritalin and see what happens to their brain a little while later. We can't do that. But he says, therefore, we need to develop social policies that encourage abundant early physical play to promote pro-social brain and mind development. And again, they've looked at as much as they can, frontal and posterior cortical regions are significantly modified by play within an hour of a 30-minute play session. So we're already starting to have, again, confirmation that play changes the brain. And the last thing is that that one of the things that Panksepp recommended, and this isn't a published study, but I think I can get you that study, or at least a reference to it, is that they routinely counseled fathers, especially in families with young ADHD children, to expend the special effort of having daily periods of rough and tumble play with their children. And everybody said the kids got better. Of course, we know that other big factor that's happening here is it's creating a positive attachment relationship, perhaps with a parent who might have felt a little more on the outside. And also, again, we often discourage males from doing rough and tumble play. They seem to be more predisposed to it. I mean, maybe in my generation, certainly my husband did rough and tumble play with our children. I didn't really do it. And so this gives the fathers a bona fide thing to do. All right. So what did we see here? Self-regulation skills are better in those children who are allowed to play without interruption. When children are engaged in a play activity, they stay selectively focused on the situation at present. They tune out distractions. They hold information in their heads. Isn't that a wonderful thing that you need to do later on when you need to do more academic kind of things? It allows children to develop the capacity to reflect, to look, to listen, to feel before acting on primary emotional urges. Rough and tumble play builds the capacity to read social signals and to manage one's behavior and urges. And ADHD seems to be related to a deficit in playtime. Now, let's look as well at what happens when we don't have play in the early years. And the research seems more and more and more to be telling us that it affects mental health and behavioral and academic outcomes. So losing the space to play. David Elkind, in his book, The Power of Play, said that over the last 2 decades, children have lost 12 hours of free time a week. And that means unstructured play. Playing soccer in an organized soccer league is not playtime. It's a pickup game. That's the playtime. Children have become more and more structured, etc. So there has been a loss there. This free, unstructured play, pickup games, self-initiated dramatic play are now being replaced by digital devices. So the playroom, we always had a playroom at our house. We had all sorts of dress-up clothes. My children were little before there were digital devices. They and all their friends would go downstairs and play dress-up. We had the best dress-up clothes in the neighborhood, and they would play dress-up. Now the kids would probably play something on the iPad. Stuart Brown, and by the way, look at these guys, the Encyclopedia of Play Science. Outdoor play has decreased by 71% in one generation, both in the US and the UK. And then Peter Gray came along, and basically he has a book, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the title of it right now. I will be providing you, not today, but shortly after today, a list of all of these resources. But basically, he concluded that the escalating diagnoses of childhood anxiety, depression, and ADHD has paralleled the loss of play. Oh my goodness. Why is play necessary for emotional well-being? Well, we know, and especially during this time of pandemic, we've probably all seen that our children, when they're stirred up emotionally, the play will reflect the themes that they're struggling with. I'm absolutely certain that there is more doctor play and nurse play and hospital play and ambulance play than ever before. A few years ago, when there was a tornado in Western Quebec, the children played tornado for weeks on end in the kindergarten, right? Because that's what stirred them up. That was what was bothering them. They had to play it through. A dear colleague of mine who works very much with very, very young children, really, really little ones, had a little 3-year-old who played for days and days and days on end with the baby dolls, playing out what it felt like, which wasn't a very good feeling, to be an older brother with a baby that he didn't like. That he played it. He didn't hurt his baby brother, but he played out those emotions with the baby dolls around what was going on in his life. Play is how children naturally make sense of all the emotions that they're experiencing. They draw pictures, they make structures, there's games, and when they come out, so it was safe for that little boy to not like his baby brother in play. And often people say to me, especially when we talk about emotions, oh my goodness, it's just so much work to keep coming alongside a child's emotions. We don't have time, Eva, with all the children in our classrooms, to do emotional therapy with all of these children. Well, if we gave them enough time to play, oh my goodness, we wouldn't have to do so much emotional work. The other thing which I would absolutely love to do, and maybe I'll have a chance in my retirement, is I would love to spend time in a K4 room, especially when there's a good chunk of time for the children to play. I would love to, and I suspect that this is what I would see. Initially, children would start playing out their emotions, and then they would turn to what we call emergent play, which is now it's no longer playing about the little brother or playing tornado or playing hospital, but now it's about stretching the imagination, becoming who you are, trying to imagine who you are. So now I'm not playing doctor because I want to feel better, that doctors are going to make somebody better, but now I'm playing doctor because I want to know what it feels like to be a person who heals other people. I think we could actually see, if we were sensitive enough to it, the switch between emotional play and emergent play. And the ideal kind of play for for brain development is emergent play, but until you deal with your emotions, you cannot take the luxury of getting into other kinds of development. The other thing we need to look at is, okay, well, if we let children play in K4 and let them play in K5, which is, by the way, of course, what we're supposed to do, but it's really tempting to want to just insert some of those letters, some of those numbers, some of that teaching, get them sitting down at a desk. Are we going to be affecting their ability to read and write later on? And again, I'm just going to give you the tip of the iceberg here. I'm going to give you access to a very comprehensive review around early literacy versus later literacy. Again, we look at Finland, we look at New Zealand, we look at England. It's all over the world. But this person pulled together incredible amounts of research on it. I'm just going to quote a piece of research that came out primarily just recently in 2022. So it's very recent research. But basically, the bottom line is this. Data through the 6th grade. So they studied these children, not just in grade 1, because absolutely right. If children just do play in K4 and K5, they are going to get to grade 1 and they're not going to know a lot of numbers and they're not going to know a lot of letters and they're not going to be able to write words and they're not going to be able to recognize words. Absolutely. They're going to be, a disaster. It's not a disaster, but anyway, they're not going to be very functional in grade 1. But that's not enough. We need to follow them through. And this big research project followed them from pre-K right the way through to grade 6. And what they found was those who were randomly assigned to an academic pre-K had lower state achievement test scores. And I know, I'm sorry, that's the United States thing. In 3rd through 6th grades than control children. So if you start teaching too early, it doesn't actually hold in grade 1 and grade 2. Maybe you're going to be slightly better than the kid who just played. But by the time you get to grade 3, actually, you are less competent. Those kids caught up between grade 1 and grade 3. And actually, by grade 6, they started to see negative effects. What they found was those children who were given a strong academic literacy-based K4 and K5, now in grade 6 started to have disciplinary problems, attendance problems, they got special education services, and it didn't keep them in school in the long term. That is quite dramatic, but not when you understand the incredible importance of the role of play. The other thing as well is in terms of comprehension, again, other studies in 2012 said that in later years, the late readers, if we didn't introduce reading until later on, they actually were surpassed the early readers, the early ones that were taught to read in comprehension abilities. We need to trust that the brain knows what it is doing. The brain knows what it is doing because it takes a lot of time to take the cerebellum and the corpus callosum and the left and the right hemisphere all to coordinate together, to build up, to kind of get activated in all the right ways. We don't know how to do that. My goodness, we have to trust in this natural process. It is May right now. I am in the process of planting my garden. And again, I know that humans are more complex than plants, but there's nothing in how to grow a good plant that says pull on it. Okay. Do I create the soil? Do I plant it in the right spot? And basically, what it seems to me, all of the research is telling us that in order to create the right conditions for our children, it is all about play, and more play. Obviously, in the context of a warm human connection, our role is to be there, to keep the children safe, to make sure that they have the space and whatever they need to play. And that means some organization. There are some children who can't play with other children. There's lots of things that we can manage that will help the play to become more effective. But ultimately, we need to understand that a child who sits at a desk and is listening to a teacher, the brain growth and development actually isn't happening. When they're sitting and listening to a teacher, the emotional development isn't happening. So we need to start trusting the neuroscience around what is important for our children, and we have to fight the tendency that parents, that sometimes our grade 1 teachers, the panic that we have, oh my goodness, he's not reading. It will come. And of course, again, we need to be inspired by Finland, where no teacher is measured on their capacity to teach children to read until the children turn 7 or 8 years old. But it's so hard to trust in the developmental process, so we need to let the children play, play with them, sing with them, dance with them, help them to get their emotions out, comfort them when the play hasn't worked out very well, give them lots of rest, provide generously, forgive easily, forgive yourself and forgive them, feel our sadness, and have faith in nature's plan. Just a quick reminder that we have one more session on the 26th of May, helping the highly sensitive child. Many of you have already signed up for that. And I will, in a few moments, put a link for an evaluation form. But I will stop at this moment and see if people have any questions or comments. Do we have anything in the chat, Patty? Not yet.
Not right yet, not yet.
Okay. Unfortunately, we can't. Well, let me just see here. I'm going to see if we can use the raise hand thing. Who has raised their hand? Okay. Sorry. I will see if I can. Okay, there we go. I will allow you to talk.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. So great. Go ahead and use your microphone.
Hello, can you hear me or?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. First of all, it was very informative. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, so my question is, I'm a social work tech in an elementary school, and our kids often play very, very rough. We have major issues of hands-on. The kids do not seem like they could regulate, and like even a simple game like tag, which I grew up as a young man playing, but it seemed like when I'm 45 years old, by the way, so it seemed like when we played tag, we were able to understand what a purpose push was and a simple momentum because we're running fast push. But our students don't seem to understand that. So we take away the game tag from them, which seems like it's, you know what I mean? So my question, I guess, is when do we draw the line? Should we allow a little bit of tag or rough play, or just completely eliminate it because they don't seem to be able to regulate themselves?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, the bottom line is, by the time they get to slightly older and bigger ages, so let's say 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, if they haven't been allowed to play in the other way, you're right. It's kind of like a paradox. Again, I'm so sorry. Many of you know that I'm well into my 70s here, and I sometimes get a little rant here, but I'm going to say it. Because our children we have to be so careful, perhaps in our daycares, that we're not allowing them to do that kind of play. We get home at night, maybe they don't even have a sibling that they can do roughhousing with. That basically, I truly believe that part of the reason why we see that at 8 or 9 years old is because the natural, normal rough and tumble play that would have happened in a home or in a small daycare that can't happen in a big official daycare, it kind of like, it sets the kids up for not being able to do it. So now you're in a 10-year-old body, but that part of your brain that should have been developed when it was little didn't get developed. And you're right, you can't seem to read it. Now, what can we do? Keep taking it away even more and more and more actually seems counterproductive. Two things that I would say. One is that understanding that because they don't have it yet, that they're going to let it out of control. The way you deal with it is it's an accident. So if one child pushes another child and it hurts, rather than trying to talk to the child who should be regulating them, we just separate the children and we make sure that the child who's been hurt feels that we recognize that wasn't fun for you. You didn't like it when he pushed you. I'm so sorry that happened. So we take care of that child's emotional needs. And then we go to the other child and say, oh my goodness, that was such a wild game. It's really hard to stop, isn't it? And then maybe we might decide that that particular child needs to be with a smaller group of children where there's much more supervision. You can't, that child whose emotions got the better of them, if you say, well, no, you shouldn't do that, and you give them a consequence, it actually doesn't grow the brain. We just need to treat it like an accident and then say, okay, I got a 10-year-old who has that regulation of a 4-year-old. What would I do with 4-year-olds? I'd provide more supervision. Anyway, it is the paradox of what we're dealing with. It's anyway, I maybe I'll find some way of saying it, but all right.
Well, thank you.
All right.
There's another question there. You highlighted, Eva, you highlighted about ADHD and play. What does research tell us about ASD and play?
Okay, ASD, of course, those children are in high alarm, because we know in the autism spectrum that the brain's capacity to filter out things that our brain normally filters out doesn't. And so as a result, the brain of a child on the autism spectrum is coping with an awful lot of stuff. When our brain, as you all know, and I think, again, having lived through the pandemic, we probably have a little bit more sensitivity to what it feels like to have a brain that is overloaded. I don't know about the rest of you, and it's been 2 years now, but I know I remember 2 years ago, just going shopping in the grocery store became overwhelming. It became overwhelming to think about going. It became overwhelming to be in there. And when I came back, I was absolutely exhausted because I had to remember, like, did I wash my hands? How close was I to the person? Do I have my mask on right? So this is the autistic brain is constantly preoccupied with trying to figure out how to make their body comfortable, how to make there not to be too much sound. So as a result, they probably do have less pure play time. Right? It's hard for them to have those kind of bubble times when, the temperature is just right. There isn't too much sound. There isn't whatever. And of course, again, sometimes our autistic children or any of our special needs children, even at very young ages, spend incredible amounts of time one-on-one with an adult, doing speech therapy, doing occupational therapy, doing ABA, which, again, many of our occupational therapists, especially our speech and language pathologists, do include an incredible amount of play. But remember, there's still a purpose to the interaction. So yes, some of our the more a special needs a child is, actually, usually the less play that they get. So again, it's one of those paradoxes where we're so scared they're going to be left behind that we basically pull on that little plant. Hopefully that answers your question.
There's a comment from Sabrina, and then I'll get to Sharon, who's waiting to ask a question. And Sabrina says she's currently reading a book called Dibs in Search of Self, and she was able to relate each of your points to the book. Dibs was stuck until he started his play therapy sessions. We see him grow and develop as the sessions go on. It's a great book.
It is, and it's an old book. It's been around for a long time. But thank you, Sabrina. And that is why play therapy is, and again, until I understood all of this, I was neither here nor there with play therapy. I thought it was lovely. Now I realize it is that safe bubble, especially for a child who has a lot of difficulties in their life. So yes, thank you for sharing that.
So Sharon, she put it in the chat. I don't know if she wants to speak, but she said, is there a way to make this webinar available to my colleagues and even the parents of our school? I think it should be required reviewing.
Yes, we will post it on our Center of Excellence website. Let me just put most of you probably should know that because you couldn't register unless you went there. Oh, no, does that go to, do you see it or no? I might have not. Okay, I think I did it. Oh, here we go. Let me put it to everyone. Okay, there we go. So type it again. So if you go to cbm.ca, it will be probably under our preschool. Then we have a section and just have to find the part that says the preschoolers. Did it go there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and by the way, before I forget, because I know some of you might have to leave, let me just go and copy the link for the evaluation of this session. And if you can just download it from the chat, or again, it'll be on our website. Yeah.
Okay, and then we have Amanda.
Mhm.
And she says, do you feel the pandemic impact of online learning has made this year's group of students harder on play as they went so long without seeing others, and others that they show, sorry, I have to scroll down. New at the game. Harder on play as they went so long without seeing others that they show the lack of knowing others' boundaries.
Yes.
Just wondering what your thoughts are.
You know, I mean, in reality, actually, if for some children, I think the pandemic was actually a boon. It was really helpful to them. In the early days, I saw families going out and playing. They could only play with their own children, and they were playing, and there was so much more playtime. You know, we couldn't do all the activities that we could. I think some children actually played more when they stayed home than others. Are they having a harder time now in our classrooms? Perhaps, but I'm not 100% sure it's because they weren't in a classroom playing, because children can play anywhere, they can play with anything. And actually, ironically, a lot of brain growth happens when you're playing by yourself. Now, do you need to play with each other? Absolutely, you need that kind of boundary thing. So yes, maybe those of them that don't have brothers and sisters at home haven't figured out how to do that with another immature being. But I think some of the difficulty in play is because emotions are much higher. There's still, we're not done the pandemic yet. Adults are more frustrated. Adults are more full of alarm. We can't ignore the effect of things like the war in Ukraine. That's affecting children's emotional well-being. So more emotions are coming out in play. And when emotions come out, especially with young children who don't have that prefrontal cortex, it can get out of control. They can start, you know, when frustration overwhelms, we do tend to hit. But I don't think it's because they haven't had practice in playing with others. I think it's because, I mean, I'm saying that's a part of it, but I do think it's because more stuff is having to come out. But again, it's how we manage it. And maybe, you know, I need to do a whole session on how we can developmentally intervene with children who don't have a prefrontal cortex, a very well, you know, brain that allows to temper them, how we intervene with them that actually takes care of the problem, but doesn't resort to talking too much or to too many consequences or even to too many rewards. Now, I know a couple of people had their hands raised, but I think that you've put your questions into the chat, so I appreciate that. Yeah, yeah. Oh, somebody put something into the Q&A. Oh, yes, you saw that one about ASD. Good. Thanks, Patty. I'm so glad you're here. I told you were my technical support. Well, thank you, everyone. We're just about at the end of our time. So if there isn't a last quick question, I will just stop the recording and just thank you all for attending. And I look forward to seeing you at our next session.